I'd like to welcome Dr. Shahir Masri. He is the Assistant Specialist in Air Pollution Exposure Assessment and Epidemiology at the University of California, co-founder on the Road for Climate Action Project, and author of Beyond Debate, Answers to 50 Misconceptions on Climate Change. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So before we start to get into climate change and that important issue, I've heard this theory and I don't see, it sounds right, but I don't know. I'm not you're a pollution expert, right?
Correct.
I have no, this sounds right. All right. But I just want to see if there's an actual scientific explanation behind it. So I heard that you can track pretty linearly the decrease in crime and the phasing out of lead in gasoline.
Yeah, and I don't have the exact statistics off my top of my head right now, but there's been a lot of research looking at exposure to lead. Lead is a neurologically active pollutant. We know very well that lead can impact behavior. Mercury exposure can similarly do that, and there's absolutely correlations between lead exposure and behavioral outcomes, including crime. There's also a lot of confounding in that, because we also know that exposure to lead happens to follow along socioeconomic gradients. So we just published a study a couple months ago looking at lead soil concentrations, or rather soil lead concentrations in the city of Santa Ana, in the county where I live. And we absolutely saw lead levels actually up to 5 times higher in the most impoverished census tracts. It's not always easy to disentangle the extent to which lead is causing crime, but there's no question that there's correlation between it. And there is some mechanistic, there are mechanisms through which lead can impact the physiology and the behavior of a person. So it's not necessarily a giant leap forward to assume that there's some influence on crime.
So maybe not necessarily a direct cause, but maybe a factor in decreasing crime.
And maybe a direct cause. So that's, still, and I don't claim to be on the frontier of this actual area of research, but my understanding is that this is not a settled question, and there actually may be a causative role there. It's hard to prove things like that, but again, lead is neurologically active. Other elements similarly affect the nervous system. So we certainly can't rule out that lead is potentially directly causing some of the behavioral outcomes that lead to increased crime. And beyond that, there is also just a dramatic correlation due to a variety of reasons. More prevalent lead exposure and many other chemical and pollutant exposures in areas that are disproportionately Hispanic or African American or low income.
So that's interesting that you've sort of connected it to, or that's to socioeconomic trends, because that's, one thing that we talk a lot about here is class and how being poor exposes you to all these different vulnerabilities that a lot of other people who are comfortable or well off or what have you don't have to go through. So how do we first of all, well, okay, so we'll back up just for a second. What do you think about the Green New Deal?
I think that we need a Green New Deal in some way, shape, or form. You hear a lot of people, naysayers, who are saying, "Oh, it's too expensive." I've written about the cost of climate change itself. So we don't necessarily get to save on cost by not taking on something ambitious like the Green New Deal. There are extremely high cost to climate change, climate impacts. We're potentially seeing some of those play out right now in Texas as they drop into record-breaking cold. Now looking to become Texas's largest, most expensive natural disaster after they've already seen Hurricane Harvey and things like that. So we don't get to avoid costs, unfortunately. There's no scenario into which that's the case. So I'm for a Green New Deal, whether it's a US Green New Deal or even a global Green New Deal. We need to be aggressive about curbing greenhouse gas emissions. And I like the social sort of clauses or aspects of the Green New Deal, which are also greatly in need. I mean, we have, more than half of the United States has negative net worth, which is absolutely horrifying. So there's absolutely a need for greater social equity.
Absolutely. And I like what you said there about, even a global Green New Deal, because another thing that's, I like to hit on is internationalism working. And internationalism gets a bad rap now because obviously, global trade has sort of destroyed our industrial base and it's displaced a lot of people's jobs, right? But building a sort of global solidarity to reverse to do what we can at this point with the 10 or 15 years that the IPCC gives us before we do irreversible damage, to work together to just try and solve this. So I like that you brought that up, but attaching it to the socioeconomic trends, how can the Green New Deal, what sort of provisions should the Green New Deal have on sort of positive class-based initiatives? Because obviously the poorest communities are the ones that are going to be the most directly affected by it and are going to need the most help the quickest. So like, how do we structure the Green New Deal to target the people who need it most first, say like Flint, for example, or like all these different communities? And that's not climate change, but just sort of like building infrastructure specifically more around the climate that impacts impoverished areas in a good way.
So the first thing I would mention is the important recognition that climate change is the topic that we're seeing. And by environmental justice, I'm essentially getting back to the disproportionate exposures and impacts that oftentimes fall upon people of low income and people of color, minority group populations. And letting climate change move forward, business as usual, emissions, we see those communities that are going to be hardest hit disproportionately, at least. So arresting climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I don't want to say in any way, shape, or form, but in general, just addressing climate change is going to disproportionately benefit those communities for the same reasons that the impacts are currently disproportionately hitting those communities. So that's just the first thing to recognize. But I still think it's important to realize that a carbon tax and things along that nature are going to have disproportionately hit low-income communities, people who depend greatest proportion of their paycheck is to pay electricity and transportation and home heating. So, there's ways to go about ensuring that those communities get basically a greater share of rebates as it relates to, or at least reduced taxes. And that's all stuff that we can work into policy, different income brackets that will subject people to different percentages of a carbon tax, to take that example. And that's something that I'm all for doing. It's also noteworthy that some of the carbon tax proposals out there, in fact, the most popular ones are those that actually give money back to the population. So not necessarily just taking a tax and just putting it all into government. These are, in some cases, revenue neutral from the perspective of the government. They don't actually give money to the government. They give the money 100% back to the population. And that can be a powerful way to gain popularity for a carbon tax, but also to ensure that the communities aren't going to be hit by something like that nearly as greatly. And there's, in fact, recently I was reading a book by Robert Pullen was one of the authors, and he's an economist, and he was talking about basically 75%, or I should say a carbon tax, a global actual carbon tax. If we just allocated 25% of the revenue from that, assuming a $20 per ton carbon tax, that would generate about $160 billion, which if you distribute it across the population is about $60 a person, $240 for a family of four. So these are I think the policies that are currently getting the most attention, that are most popular, and that would have the least impact to society.
So how do we also apply, because here's the thing, if we apply the same thing to a global perspective, like, a global Green New Deal, how do we take the entire world off of carbon-based fuels and stop climate change while also not putting a disproportionate amount of the burden on poorer countries in the global south?
Sure. So let's take the example of the global Green New Deal that Robert Pullen was proposing, since we're on the topic. Where would the revenue come from? First of all, how much money would be needed? So he estimates that around $2.4 trillion beginning in 2024, extending to 2050, would be needed to basically keep. I think he was looking at the 1.5 degree Celsius target. So to keep us from that target of warming, assuming a $2.4 trillion a year investment, which would be scaled up over time, sounds like a lot. It's about 0.7% of the global asset pool. But where would that money come from? Like you're mentioning, without disproportionately impacting in underdeveloped countries and disadvantaged communities. So carbon tax, he estimates, or he proposes, just taking again the $20 per ton carbon tax has been thrown out there quite a bit, and this so let's take that example: $20 per ton of carbon collected. This would be global. This would be, if you just took that right off the bat, would amount to about almost a little over $600 billion. If you took just a quarter of that, you're getting to pay off a fraction of already what he's explained. And let's think about what that means in terms of, let's say, gasoline, for instance. So for every dollar of tax that you apply, so $20 per ton, for every dollar, it comes to about an extra cent per gallon of gasoline. Average globally, it translates to only about a 5% increase in gasoline prices. Not too dramatic, I don't think, but let's continue down the example. So the military budget, which you're probably aware, as of 2018, $1.8 trillion, right? That's just military budget alone. The US alone, $700 billion of that, about 40%. So just skimming off a minuscule 6%, in his calculations, just a minuscule 6% would translate right there to $100 billion annually, and that's actually a pretty seemingly attainable percentage to redirect. And if we truly believe the idea that military is intended to ensure security for its population, then this would be an extremely worthwhile thing to do, just to protect our population. We saw in 2007 to 9 financial crisis, around $12 trillion get pretty much thrown into the financial system on a dime to prevent market collapse and continue economic growth and so on and so forth. That suggests a real capacity for nations, particularly European and Western nations, to contribute meaningfully to a Green New Deal, global Green New Deal. So, if we estimate the US and Europe each contributing $150 billion, that gets us to $300 billion. That should be easily obtainable. That's just a percent of what was thrown on a dime at a dime to the financial crisis in 2008. Moving forward, elimination of fossil fuel subsidies. So it was recently estimated about $3 trillion are given to the fossil fuel companies in the form of subsidies globally. Now that's an astounding amount of number. Just redirecting that in its entirety would cover this $2.4 trillion necessity. Now, of course, 100%, removing all those subsidies would also have economic impacts. They wouldn't necessarily be favorable, especially to the communities you're talking about. But if we redirected, say, 25% of that right there is $750 billion. So those different things, those four major actions would cover that $2.4 trillion needed to achieve a global Green New Deal. And you saw that a fair fraction of that actually could come from the green bond lending and also redirection of military budget.
Perfect. Yeah. It actually sounds attainable, kind of.
It does, right? And a lot of these are pretty conservative estimates. I mean, we could, I think, really readily obtain these figures and these percentages.
Yeah.
It takes will, right? Political will.
Honestly, and that's really what we lack in this age of sort of neoliberalism. That's what I think it is. It just seems that nobody wants to do anything, and anything they do want to do is like very watered down and very like it doesn't upset anybody. Like, and I can see why, but it's just also like, hey, we only got like 15 years, brother. Like we gotta speed this up.
Yeah, 100%.
So this is sort of a more of a philosophical question. It might not be. It might be actually a practical question. Do you think the interests of capitalism and solving climate change are opposed?
So I think that maybe strictly speaking, capitalism has obviously resulted in dramatic impacts and the impacts of the climate that we're talking about. However, whether we can solve this problem in a framework that excludes capitalism and that is not capitalistic in nature, I think is unrealistic. And in that way, I don't think that they're opposed. I think that the solutions that are realistically going to arrest us from rapidly warming climate are capitalist in nature, and anything that's going to be successful has got to come quickly. And that there are a variety of instruments, a variety of ways to move us forward, as some of which I just mentioned, that fall within the capitalist framework. And I think that to suggest realistically that we're going to somehow do this outside of capitalism or after a restructuring of the entire sort of governing, principles that make, unfortunately, the world go around today, I just don't think is realistic given the urgency to move forward with climate action now or yesterday, in fact.
Right. And yeah, I'd say you're probably right about it, as in like we're not going to be able to overthrow capitalism and then solve climate change in 15 years. That's just not going to happen. No system is overthrown that quickly, like in a 15-year period. So no, I get that, but do you think there's a like clearly these oil companies, like, and the people who run them or work for them, they know that obviously oil isn't good for the environment, coal isn't good for the environment, and yet these oil companies, to keep their industry afloat, much like the cigarette companies, sort of have pushed out all this propaganda about, oh no, really, we have and Volkswagen did as well, and they got caught. But our current, I think one of the problems with our sort of stagnation is that our government just is bought by these people. It's hard to, and it's going to be hard to like reconcile, like, well, actually, that gets to something else too. Do you ever think there will be like a mea culpa for like for the oil companies, like there was for big tobacco? Like, do you ever think there will be a day where they're in a courtroom and they're saying, yeah, we made all this up, we funded all these right-wing think tanks that tried to say climate change wasn't real. Do you ever think
Well,
there will be any sort of justice like that?
well, there was a day when that took place. Now, it didn't unfortunately result in the you know. By the way, my alarm just went off, so this would be my 5 minute warning before I'll have to get off, and then we can rejoin it after one.
Cool. Yeah. So
So
just finish this answer and then we can be done.
sure. So there was a day when those entities were in the courtroom. Now, unfortunately, it didn't. The verdict wasn't in favor of the plaintiffs, who were a collection of 21 youth from around the country who were basically alleging that the fossil fuel industry had knowingly stolen their future through what you just described, propaganda and smearing of climate science and so forth. So whether or not we'll see a verdict in the opposite direction, I don't necessarily feel optimistic, given that one of the traditions in law is to use prior court cases to determine future outcomes. So we may not see this win in the courtroom. But who knows if there's different cases that take slightly different forms that would result in different outcomes. I think that getting back to your overarching question and pointing out, some of the flaws in the current system and how it's bought by the wealthy and basically essentially bought by the wealthy. I think that you're absolutely right, and there's serious flaws in the current system. And there needs to be some sort of accountability on the part of CEOs to something other than simply the bottom line, the short-term bottom line, and current shareholders. There's got to be some incorporation of environmental and social wellness and equity. I 100% think that we can't have these paradoxes where or these conflicting interests where you have somebody who is presiding over the most influential source of greenhouse gas emissions, whose actual job description prevents them from doing anything about the pollution they're creating. So there's serious flaws that need to be reconciled. I totally think that. And same thing with the laws that allow money to have essentially be considered free speech, things like that certainly need to be redone. I don't necessarily think that it has to fall outside of capitalism. We saw, I think the Green New Deal is an example actually of how laws and statutes can actually work to equalize the playing field and actually obtain equity. And I think that, the 1970s was a great example of how laws and the legal framework could actually lead to dramatic improvements in the environment with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, Endangered Species Act, so on and so forth. So some of those have been watered down over time, but I think there's potential to have a lot of positive action through the existing framework. But I think that it needs to be pushed by the people. And that's what was the case in the 1970s. That was actually the case not only within the public, but also in Congress. The environment was not a partisan issue back in 1970, 1975. It was actually bipartisan. We saw overwhelming majorities in both the House and Senate voting in favor of major environmental policies. The real key here, if you ask me, isn't necessarily the need for a collapse of the existing system. It's the need for the participation on behalf of the public to actually better and improve the existing system. And right now we have a lot of people who are pretty inactive as it relates to shaping their own government. And pretty much, we still have a pretty poor turnout for presidential elections, even though we saw record turnout in this case recently. But outside of presidential elections, the turnout is even more dismal. Maybe congressional elections or midterm elections are more dismal, but outside of midterm and presidential elections, I mean, we're talking about an extremely low turnout in terms of participation. So I think that's the real key if we're going to improve the world, is getting people to care and take part in the system we currently have, let alone anything new.
Mass mobilization.